Melody Shari was treated people switched up on her, used her situation for storylines, and then acted like none of it happened. And no, I'm not just going to move on because she's no longer on the show, because the same patterns are still happening. The show hasn't felt the same since she stepped back, and now a lot of what we're seeing feels forced. In that interview, it was also said that people will sacrifice real friendships just to stay relevant, but that's something we've already seen play out before. Then there were claims about conversations involving Martell Holt and Melody, but when those claims were questioned, the details didn't line up and the story kept changing. At one point, it even shifted into accusations like grooming, which didn't match the original topic, making it feel more like deflection than truth. And that's the real issue: contradictions. When certain people do something, it's overlooked, but when it happens to them, suddenly it becomes a problem. That double standard is obvious. We've seen friendships fall apart on the show time and time again because people choose drama over loyalty, and when relationships are built on negativity, they don't last. At the end of the day, I'm just pointing out what's already been shown: the patterns, the inconsistencies, and the way everything keeps repeating itself. So the real question is, what do you think about it? And when you really sit back and look at everything, it becomes even clearer that this isn't just about one moment or one misunderstanding. It's a pattern that keeps repeating itself. People come on the show, form alliances, and then the moment it benefits them, those same relationships get thrown to the side for a storyline or a reaction. That's why it's hard to take certain statements seriously now, because we've already seen how quickly things can switch up depending on what's convenient at the time. What makes it worse is that when these situations are happening to someone else, it's brushed off or even laughed at, but the moment the roles are reversed, now it's a serious issue that needs to be addressed. That inconsistency is exactly why so many viewers are starting to question everything they're seeing. And let's be real, when those accusations and stories were being brought up, instead of clearly explaining what actually happened, the conversation kept shifting. One minute it's one claim, the next minute it's something completely different, and before you know it, the original point is lost. That's what makes people side-eye the situation, because if something is true, it shouldn't be that hard to explain or keep consistent. It starts to feel like certain things were said just to create a moment, not because they were rooted in facts. At the same time, this is exactly how reality TV works. Emotions get heightened, situations get exaggerated, and sometimes people go further than they normally would just to stay in the spotlight. But there's still a line, and when that line gets crossed, especially when it involves real friendships and serious accusations, it changes how everything is perceived. It stops being entertaining and starts feeling messy in a way that's hard to ignore. So now, with everything unfolding the way it is, it's not surprising to see relationships falling apart or tension building up. When things are built on shaky foundations like competition, jealousy, or unresolved issues, they're eventually going to collapse. And that's exactly what we're watching happen in real time. The only difference now is that people are paying closer attention, picking up on the contradictions, and no longer just accepting everything at face value. At the end of it all, it really comes down to accountability and consistency. If you're going to call something out, you have to be willing to own your own actions too. Otherwise, it just comes across as selective outrage, and people can see right through that. That's why conversations like this keep coming up, because viewers aren't just watching for drama anymore, they're paying attention to the bigger picture. And honestly, that bigger picture keeps pointing back to the same thing: intent. At some point, you have to ask whether these moments are happening naturally or if they're being created just to keep attention on certain people. Because when the same individuals keep finding themselves at the center of drama, with stories that don't quite add up, it stops feeling coincidental and starts looking strategic. That's when viewers begin to disconnect, because instead of watching real relationships unfold, it starts to feel like calculated moves for relevance. What also stands out is how quickly narratives get rewritten. One day, someone is defending a situation or a person, and the next day, they're completely against it, but there's no real acknowledgement of that shift. It's like the expectation is that the audience won't notice, or will just go along with whatever the current storyline is. But people do notice, and that's why the conversations online have become more critical. Viewers aren't just reacting emotionally anymore. They're analyzing patterns, comparing past behavior, and calling out inconsistencies in real time. And when you bring it back to the situation involving Melody Shari Rogers and Martell Holt, it becomes even more layered. That wasn't just TV drama, that was a real-life situation that people inserted themselves into, picked sides on, and in some cases, benefited from. So when similar tactics show up again, it's hard not to compare. It raises the question of whether lessons were actually learned, or if the same cycle is just repeating with different circumstances. At the same time, there's also accountability on the audience side. Reality TV thrives because people watch, engage, and keep the conversations going. But now, it seems like viewers are becoming more selective about what they support. They're questioning motives, calling out double standards, and not just accepting everything at face value like before. That shift in audience perspective is powerful because it changes how these shows are received and, ultimately, how the people on them move. So moving forward, it'll be interesting to see whether anything actually changes or if the same patterns continue to play out. Because at some point, constant contradictions and recycled drama stop being entertaining and start feeling predictable. And once that happens, it's hard to keep people invested. The real test is whether the focus will shift back to authenticity and genuine connections, or if it will stay centered on moments that feel forced and temporary. And if we're being honest, that's the turning point every reality show eventually faces, when the audience starts valuing authenticity over chaos. Because drama might grab attention in the moment, but it's consistency and real connections that actually keep people invested long-term. When everything starts to feel staged or overly calculated, viewers don't just lose interest, they start questioning the credibility of everything they're watching. Another thing that can't be ignored is how accountability tends to show up only when it's convenient. People are quick to call others out, but when it's time to reflect on their own actions, suddenly the energy shifts. That imbalance is what creates frustration among viewers, because it feels like there are different rules for different people. And once that perception sets in, it becomes hard to take any of the conflicts at face value. At the same time, the pressure of being in the spotlight plays a role too. Being on a show like Love and Marriage, Huntsville means your personal life is constantly under a microscope, and that can blur the line between what's real and what's being amplified for TV. But even with that pressure, there's still a level of responsibility that comes with how situations are handled, especially when real relationships and reputations are involved. What we're seeing now feels like a shift, not just within the show, but within the audience itself. People are more aware, more observant, and less willing to ignore inconsistencies. They're paying attention to timelines, to behavior patterns, and to how stories evolve over time. And that awareness is changing the way these narratives are received. So at this point, it's not just about who said what or who did what. It's about whether anything meaningful is actually being learned or changed. Because if the same cycles keep repeating, eventually the drama loses its impact. It stops being shocking and just becomes expected. And maybe that's where things stand now at a crossroads. Either there's a shift toward more genuine, honest storytelling, or things continue down the same path of recycled conflict and contradictions. But one thing is clear, the audience is watching differently now, and that alone has the power to influence what happens next. And when the audience starts watching differently, it puts pressure on everyone involved to move differently too. Because at the end of the day, no matter how production tries to shape a storyline, it's the viewers who decide what actually lands and what doesn't. If people are no longer reacting the way they used to, if they're questioning instead of blindly supporting, that changes the entire dynamic. It forces a shift, whether the cast acknowledges it or not. You can already see signs of that shift happening. Moments that might have once gone unquestioned are now being picked apart. People are revisiting old clips, comparing statements, and noticing things that didn't add up before. And once those patterns become obvious, it's hard to unsee them. That's why certain narratives aren't hitting the same anymore, because the audience is no longer approaching them the same way. It also raises a bigger question about longevity. How long can a show sustain itself on recycled conflict and inconsistent storytelling? At some point, there has to be growth either in the relationships, the conversations, or the way situations are handled. Without that, everything starts to feel repetitive, like you're watching the same storyline play out with slightly different details. And for the people involved, that's where self-awareness becomes important. Because the more the audience evolves, the more noticeable it is when the cast doesn't. Viewers can tell when someone is being genuine versus when they're performing, and that difference matters. Authentic moments resonate. Forced ones don't last. So now it's less about the drama itself and more about how it's being delivered. Are we seeing real accountability? Are we seeing honest conversations? Or are we just seeing the same cycles dressed up in new situations? Those are the things that will determine whether people stay invested or start tuning out. At the end of it all, the power really does sit with the audience. What people choose to support, engage with, and believe ultimately shapes the direction of everything. And right now, it's clear that viewers are asking for more honesty, more consistency, and more authenticity. The question is whether the show and the people on it are willing to meet that moment, or if they'll keep relying on the same formula and risk losing the audience altogether. And if that moment isn't met, then what you end up with is a show that slowly loses its impact, not all at once, but piece by piece. The excitement fades, the conversations lose their spark, and what once felt unpredictable starts to feel routine. That's the risk when the same formulas get reused without any real evolution. People don't just want noise, they want meaning behind what they're watching. And that's where everything circles back to credibility. Once viewers start questioning what's real and what's being exaggerated, it creates distance. They may still watch, but they're watching differently, less emotionally invested, more observant, more critical. And that shift is hard to reverse because trust, once lost, isn't easily rebuilt. At the same time, there's still an opportunity here. Shows like Love and Marriage, Huntsville have the platform to go deeper, to show growth, to actually address the issues they bring up instead of just moving on to the next dramatic moment. Because real accountability, real conversations, and real resolution, that's the kind of content that actually sticks with people. And for the individuals involved, this is where legacy comes into play. How do they want to be remembered? As people who constantly stirred chaos for attention, or as people who evolved, took responsibility, and showed something real? Because whether they realize it or not, the audience is already forming those opinions based on what they're seeing now. So moving forward, it's not just about keeping attention, it's about keeping respect. And those are two very different things. Attention can be gained quickly through drama, but respect is built over time through consistency and authenticity. And right now, it feels like the audience is leaning more toward valuing respect than just reacting to whatever moment is put in front of them. At the end of the day, the conversation has grown beyond just who's right and who's wrong. It's about patterns, accountability, and whether anything is actually changing. Because if it's not, then no matter how dramatic things get, it's only a matter of time before people start tuning out completely. And once that happens, no storyline, no matter how big, can bring that same level of interest back. And when it reaches that point, it's not about one scene, one argument, or one headline anymore. It's about the overall feeling people get when they watch. If the energy feels repetitive, forced, or disconnected from reality, viewers start to check out mentally even if they're still tuning in physically. That emotional disconnect is what really changes everything, because once people stop feeling invested, it's hard to pull them back in. What's interesting is that this doesn't happen overnight. It builds slowly through moments that don't quite land, stories that don't fully make sense, and reactions that feel more performative than genuine. Over time, those small cracks turn into a bigger gap between what's being shown and what the audience believes. And once that gap gets too wide, it becomes difficult for any storyline, no matter how dramatic, to feel impactful. At the same time, this could easily be a reset moment. Sometimes shows hit a point like this where they either evolve or they fade. Evolution doesn't necessarily mean less drama, it just means more honesty within it. Real conversations, real accountability, and real growth can still be compelling, if not more so, than manufactured conflict. In fact, that's often what brings people back, because it feels relatable instead of rehearsed. There's also something to be said about consistency and character. Viewers don't expect perfection, but they do expect some level of alignment. When someone constantly shifts their stance depending on the situation, it becomes harder to connect with them. But when people own their